My name is Ahmad, and I need to tell you something that kept me awake for months before I found the courage to speak it aloud. A few weeks ago, while scrolling through YouTube at 3 in the morning during another sleepless night, I stumbled across one of your videos. It was the testimony of a man from Indonesia who spoke about hearing Jesus call his name in a dream. I watched it 17 times that night, my hands trembling as I replayed his words about finding peace he never knew existed. Something in his voice, in the way he described that moment of recognition, shattered a wall inside me I didn't even know I'd built. That video saved my life, though I didn't understand it then. Now I do. And I think it's time I shared my own story, the one that's been burning in my chest ever since. I was raised in the shadow of the great mosque that dominated our neighborhood, its minaret casting long shadows across our courtyard. Every evening, as the call to prayer echoed through the narrow streets, my father, Ibrahim, served as one of the mosque's most respected teachers, his voice carrying the weight of generations of faith whenever he spoke. Our home was a place of order, where every prayer rug had its designated spot, where the Quran's verses were recited with perfect pronunciation at dawn and dusk, where visitors came seeking my father's counsel on matters of faith and law. I was the eldest son, groomed from childhood to follow in his footsteps, to carry forward a tradition that stretched back through centuries of believers. The marble floors of our house were always cool beneath my bare feet during morning prayers, and I remember the way the early light would filter through the carved wooden screens, casting intricate patterns across the walls where calligraphy promised paradise to the faithful. My mother would prepare sweet tea afterward, the steam rising from delicate glasses as we broke our fast together. These were moments of profound peace, when I felt connected to something larger than myself, anchored in rituals that had comforted millions before me. My younger sisters would sit quietly, their eyes bright with the certainty that comes from never having questioned anything, and I envied them that simplicity. But even then, in those peaceful mornings, there was something else stirring in the quiet spaces between prayers, a restlessness that I pushed down, deeper each time it surfaced. During the long prostrations, when my forehead touched the prayer rug, and the world disappeared into the rhythm of Arabic words, my mind would drift to faces I'd seen in the streets. The beggar woman with hollow eyes who sat outside the market, clutching her baby, while people stepped around her as if she were invisible. The young boy who sold tissues at traffic lights, his clothes torn, and his smile too weary for someone so small. These images would float through my consciousness like unwelcome visitors, disrupting the serenity I was supposed to feel in submission to Allah. I told myself these thoughts were normal, that compassion was part of faith, that noticing suffering was what made us human. My father had taught me that charity was one of the pillars of our religion, that helping those in need was a sacred duty, but there was something in the way he qualified these teachings, the subtle boundaries he drew around who deserved help and who didn't, that left a strange taste in my mouth. The faithful poor, yes, those who showed proper gratitude and humility, certainly, but the others, the ones whose need couldn't be neatly categorized, whose suffering fell outside the prescribed parameters of worthiness. They existed in a gray area that made my chest tight with unnamed anxiety. I was 23 when the first crack appeared, though I wouldn't recognize it as such until much later. It was during Ramadan, that holiest of months, when the community came together in fasting and prayer. I had been walking home from the mosque after evening prayers when I heard someone crying in the alley behind the building where my father taught. The sound was raw, desperate, cutting through the warm night air like a blade. I found a young woman, maybe my age, sitting against the wall with her hijab askew and her face swollen from weeping. Her name was Layla, and she was pregnant. The story poured out of her in fragments broken by sobs. She had been married to a man chosen by her family, a man twice her age, who beat her when she couldn't conceive quickly enough to suit him. When she finally became pregnant, he accused her of infidelity because the child didn't look like him in her womb's ultrasound. Her own family had turned their backs on her, afraid of the scandal, afraid of being associated with a woman whose reputation had been questioned. The imam had refused to intervene, saying that marital affairs were private matters and that she must have done something to deserve her husband's anger. I sat with her in that alley for 3 hours, listening to her story, watching her cradle her belly, as if protecting the life inside from the cruelty of the world it would soon enter. When she finally asked me what she should do, I had no answer. Everything I'd been taught about justice, about protection of the innocent, about the mercy of Allah, felt hollow in the face of her suffering. The systems that should have sheltered her had failed, and the men who claimed to speak for God had turned away from her pain. I gave her what money I had in my pockets and promised to ask my father for guidance, though something in my gut told me I already knew what his response would be. That moment cracked something open in me. I didn't know what it meant, but what came next, I was not ready for it. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Layla's face burned into my memory like a photograph I couldn't stop looking at. The comfortable certainties of my faith felt suddenly fragile, like ice beginning to thaw under an unexpected sun. I had always believed that following the rules, obeying the teachings, and maintaining proper conduct would lead to righteousness and peace. But here was a woman who had done everything expected of her, who had submitted to every authority placed over her, and she was drowning in a system that valued appearance over truth, order over mercy. The questions that had been whispers in the back of my mind for years suddenly became shouts I could no longer ignore. If Allah was merciful, why did the religious authorities show so little mercy to those who needed it most? If our faith was supposed to protect the vulnerable, why did it seem to protect the powerful instead? If submission to divine will was the path to peace, why did I feel so much turmoil when I tried to accept what I was seeing? These weren't academic questions anymore. They were urgent, personal, threatening to undermine everything I thought I knew about myself and my place in the world. I never did ask my father about Layla. 3 days later, I heard she had disappeared, and no one seemed particularly concerned about where she might have gone or what might have happened to her. The ease with which her existence was erased from the community's consciousness horrified me more than any dramatic crisis could have. She had simply ceased to matter, become inconvenient enough to ignore, and life continued as if she had never been there at all. That was when I realized that the crack in my faith wasn't going to heal itself. It was going to keep growing until something inside me broke completely, and I wasn't sure I had the strength to survive whatever was coming next. 3 weeks passed after Layla vanished, and I found myself questioning everything with an intensity that scared me. I would sit in the mosque during Friday prayers, listening to my father's voice echo through the hall as he spoke about divine justice and perfect submission. But the words seemed to bounce off me like stones off water. I kept thinking about her empty eyes, the way she had looked at me when I promised to help, the trust that I had ultimately failed to honor. The more I tried to push these thoughts away, the stronger they became, until they followed me into my dreams and haunted the spaces between my prayers. It was during one of these restless nights that I made my first real mistake, the one that would change everything. Unable to sleep, I had wandered down to the kitchen for water when I heard voices from my father's study. The door was slightly ajar, and through the gap I could see him sitting with two other men from the mosque council, their faces grave in the lamplight. They were discussing Layla, and what I heard made my blood turn cold. They knew where she was, had known all along. She was being held at a facility outside the city, a place where wayward women were sent to be corrected before being returned to their families or married off to men willing to take damaged goods. My father's voice was calm as he explained the arrangement, how her family had paid the council to handle the situation discreetly, how her husband had been convinced to take her back once she learned proper obedience. "She'll be grateful eventually," one of the other men said, sipping tea as if they were discussing the weather. "They always are, once they understand that resistance only brings more suffering." My father nodded approvingly, then added something that made my knees buckle. "The important thing is that this never becomes public. We cannot have other women getting ideas about questioning their situations. One case of rebellion can spread like disease if we're not careful." I backed away from the door, my heart hammering so hard I was sure they would hear it. These men, who stood before our community every week speaking of mercy and compassion, who claimed to serve a God of infinite love, were casually discussing the imprisonment and forced marriage of a woman whose only crime was being the victim of cruelty. The hypocrisy was so profound, so absolute, that I felt something fundamental shift inside my chest, like a bone breaking cleanly after too much pressure. That night, I couldn't pray. I tried, kneeling on my rug as I had thousands of times before, but the words wouldn't come. Every verse I attempted to recite reminded me of the conversation I'd overheard, of the gap between what we claimed to believe and what we actually practiced. When I finally gave up and crawled into bed, I was shaking with something I couldn't name. It wasn't just anger, though anger was part of it. It wasn't just disappointment, though that was there too. It was something deeper, more devastating. It was the death of certainty, the collapse of a worldview that had been holding me together for 23 years. The next morning at breakfast, my father asked if I was feeling well. I must have looked as shattered as I felt, because my mother kept touching my forehead and offering remedies for various ailments. I wanted to scream at them, to demand explanations for what I'd heard, to force them to acknowledge the cruelty they were enabling. Instead, I mumbled something about not sleeping well and excused myself as soon as possible. I didn't trust myself to stay in their presence without saying something that would reveal how much I'd heard, how much I now knew about the darkness hiding behind our family's respected facade. I thought I could walk away from what I'd learned, could somehow unknow what I now knew about the men I'd been raised to revere. But I had no idea what was waiting around the corner. That afternoon, while helping my father organize his books, I discovered something that would shatter what remained of my faith in ways I never could have imagined. Hidden behind a row of commentaries was a folder containing correspondence with other religious authorities, letters discussing the problem of young people asking uncomfortable questions about traditional practices. The language was clinical, strategic, treating doubters like threats to be neutralized rather than souls to be guided. One letter, written in my father's careful script, particularly caught my attention. It was addressed to an imam in a neighboring city, sharing techniques for identifying and managing spiritual corruption in young men who showed signs of questioning established interpretations. The methods described were subtle but devastating: social isolation, increased surveillance, arranged marriages to stabilize troublesome individuals, and in extreme cases, temporary removal from the community until proper submission could be re-established. Reading my father's words, I realized that I was likely already being watched, already categorized as a potential problem requiring intervention. The worst part was discovering that this wasn't unique to our community. The letters revealed a network of religious leaders coordinating their efforts to suppress questions and maintain control over their congregations. Young women like Layla were just collateral damage in a larger war against anything that threatened the established order. The men I'd been taught to see as holy were functioning more like administrators of a system designed to perpetuate itself, regardless of the human cost. Every sermon about love and mercy was revealed as performance. Every claim of divine authority exposed as a mask for very human desires for power and control. I spent the next week in a state of barely controlled panic, going through the motions of normal life while internally reeling from what I'd discovered. Every conversation with my father felt like a minefield, every family prayer like an elaborate charade I was being forced to perform. The weight of my secret knowledge was crushing, but I had no one to share it with. My friends from the mosque were too embedded in the system to question it, my family too invested in maintaining their status to tolerate dissent. I was completely alone with truths that were too dangerous to speak and too urgent to ignore. During prayers, I found myself studying the faces around me, wondering how many others had seen behind the curtain and chosen to stay silent. How many mothers knew what happened to daughters who asked too many questions? How many fathers participated in the networks of control while convincing themselves they were serving God? How many young men like me suspected the truth but lacked the courage to confront it? The isolation was suffocating, made worse by the knowledge that admitting my doubts would only make me the next target for correction. It was then that the dreams began to change. Instead of the familiar anxiety dreams about failing exams or disappointing my father, I started having dreams about searching for something I couldn't name. I would find myself walking through endless corridors lined with locked doors, hearing voices calling from behind them, but unable to find the keys. Sometimes I would dream of standing in a vast library where all the books had blank pages, or sitting in a mosque where the prayers echoed but carried no meaning. These dreams left me exhausted and unsettled, as if my subconscious was trying to process revelations my waking mind couldn't handle. The breaking point came 2 weeks later, during what should have been a routine evening prayer. My father was leading us through the familiar verses when he reached a passage about God's perfect justice and infinite mercy. As he recited the words in Arabic, their meaning in our language rang in my head with bitter irony. Perfect justice that ignored the suffering of innocents. Infinite mercy that was rationed out based on compliance and status. Divine love that seemed to flow primarily toward those who already held power and privilege. The contradiction was so stark, so undeniable, that I felt something snap inside my chest like a wire under too much tension. I couldn't continue the prayer. I simply stopped moving, stopped reciting, stopped pretending that any of this made sense anymore. My father's voice continued without missing a beat, but I could feel my mother's worried glances, my sister's confusion at my sudden stillness. When the prayer ended and my family began their evening routines, I remained kneeling on my rug, staring at the intricate patterns woven into its surface and wondering how I had never noticed how they seemed to trap the eye in endless loops that led nowhere. That was the night I first whispered a question into the darkness of my room that would change everything. If this isn't truth, I asked the silence, then what is? I didn't expect an answer, didn't even know who I was asking. But something in the act of speaking that question aloud felt like stepping through a door I couldn't close again. I had finally admitted to myself that everything I'd been taught might be wrong, that the foundation of my entire life might be built on lies and compromises, and the systematic oppression of anyone who threatened the comfortable certainties of those in power. The next morning, I woke up feeling like a stranger in my own skin. Every routine felt foreign. Every familiar space seemed subtly altered, as if I was seeing my life through different eyes. My father greeted me with his usual warmth. My mother served breakfast with her customary care. My sisters chattered about their plans for the day. But I felt like I was watching all of this from a great distance, like an actor who had forgotten his lines in the middle of a play. I smiled and nodded and played my part, but inside, I was screaming with the need to find something real, something true, something that wouldn't crumble the moment I looked at it too closely. I had no idea that my desperate question in the darkness had been heard by someone I never expected to answer. I had no idea that the searching and questioning and desperate hunger for truth that was tearing me apart from the inside was actually preparing me for an encounter that would redefine everything. I thought I knew about faith, about God, about what it meant to be truly alive. All I knew was that I couldn't continue living a lie. Couldn't keep pretending that the system that had shaped me was worthy of my devotion when I had seen its cruelty firsthand. The forbidden thought had finally taken root in my mind, growing stronger with each passing day, despite my efforts to suppress it. What if the men who claimed to speak for God were actually speaking for themselves? What if the traditions I'd been raised to honor were actually chains designed to keep people from discovering real truth? What if there was something beyond the walls of my comfortable prison, something worth the risk of losing everything I'd ever known? These questions terrified me, but they also filled me with a strange, desperate hope that maybe, somewhere beyond the reach of human control and manipulation, authentic divine love actually existed. I just had to find the courage to go looking for it, even if it meant walking away from everything and everyone I'd ever trusted. even if it meant discovering that the God I'd been worshiping was nothing like the God who was actually waiting to be found. The whisper came to me 3 nights later, carried on a wind that smelled of jasmine and rain, even though the sky was clear. I was lying in bed, exhausted from another day of performing normalcy while internally screaming, when I heard my name spoken so softly I almost missed it. Not my Arabic name, Ahmad, but something else. Something that sounded like it was spoken in a language I'd never learned, but somehow understood. The voice was gentle, patient, infinitely kind, and it seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding, scanning the darkness of my room for any sign of an intruder. But I was alone, and the voice hadn't come from outside me. It had come from somewhere deeper, somewhere I'd never known existed until that moment. "Who are you?" I whispered into the darkness, feeling foolish even as the words left my lips. The response didn't come in words, but in a sensation, a warmth that spread through my chest like sunlight breaking through clouds. Somehow, without explanation or proof, I knew that the voice belonged to someone who had been waiting for me to ask the right questions. Someone who had been watching my struggle with patience and compassion I'd never experienced before. This wasn't the distant, demanding voice of divine authority I'd been taught to expect. This was personal, intimate, immediate. It felt like coming home to a place I'd never been, like being recognized by someone I'd never met but had been searching for my entire life without knowing it. The warmth in my chest grew stronger, accompanied by a peace so profound it made me weep. For the first time in months, the anxiety and confusion and desperate questions that had been tormenting me quieted to a whisper. I wasn't getting answers exactly, but I was getting something better. The assurance that answers existed and that I wasn't alone in seeking them. Over the following weeks, the encounters became more frequent and more vivid. Sometimes I would wake in the middle of the night to find my room filled with a soft, golden light that had no source I could identify. Other times, I would be walking through the city and suddenly feel that presence beside me. Invisible, but unmistakable. Like a friend walking close enough for his warmth to reach me. The voice would speak to me in moments when I least expected it, offering comfort when I was struggling with doubt or giving me strength when the weight of my secret knowledge became too heavy to bear alone. I began to understand that I was being prepared for something, though I couldn't imagine what. The presence never demanded anything from me, never threatened punishment for my questions, or required proof of my devotion. Instead, it seemed to encourage my search for truth, to validate my horror at the cruelty I'd witnessed, to confirm that my instincts about love and mercy and justice were not naive idealism, but reflections of something real and eternal. This was so different from everything I'd been taught about divine interaction that it took me weeks to trust it, to believe that I wasn't losing my mind or being deceived by wishful thinking. But the changes in me were undeniable. Despite the chaos in my external life, despite the growing tension with my family as they sensed my withdrawal from their certainties, I was experiencing a peace I'd never known existed. The desperate hunger that had been driving me to question everything was being satisfied, not with answers, but with relationship, not with explanations, but with love. I found myself able to smile genuinely for the first time in months, to feel hope creeping back into places that had been dark with despair and confusion. My family noticed the change, but misinterpreted it completely. They assumed I was finally coming to my senses, finally accepting the wisdom of our traditions after a period of youthful rebellion. My father began talking about my future again, about the teaching position waiting for me at the mosque, about the suitable wife his friends had suggested, about the respectable life I could build within the safe boundaries of everything I now knew to be corrupt. Their relief and approval should have made me happy, but instead it filled me with sorrow. They loved me, but they loved a version of me that was dying a little more each day. I started taking long walks at night, partly to escape the suffocating atmosphere at home, and partly because the presence seemed stronger in the darkness and solitude. During these walks, I would find myself drawn to parts of the city I'd never explored before. Neighborhoods where different kinds of people lived different kinds of lives. I saw poverty that our mosque's charity never reached, communities that survived on their own networks of mutual support, families that functioned with love instead of hierarchy. The contrast with the rigid, controlled environment I'd grown up in was stark and illuminating. It was during one of these walks that I found the small shop tucked away in an alley I'd never noticed before. The elderly man behind the counter had the kindest eyes I'd ever seen, and when he looked at me, I had the strange sensation that he saw something others missed. We didn't speak the same language well, but somehow we managed to communicate. He seemed to understand that I was searching for something, and after several visits, he quietly slipped me a small book wrapped in brown paper. "For your questions," he said in broken Arabic, and his smile was so gentle I almost cried right there in his shop. The book was unlike anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't written in Arabic or any language I recognized at first, but as I stared at the pages, the symbols seemed to shift and resolve into words I could understand. It told stories about a man who lived 2,000 years ago, a teacher who spoke about love without conditions and forgiveness without limits. The man in these stories didn't build institutions or establish hierarchies or create systems of control. Instead, he touched lepers and ate with outcasts and forgave enemies and spoke about God in ways that sounded nothing like the sermons I'd grown up hearing. His name was Isa in the book, though I'd heard him called by other names in whispered conversations about forbidden topics. As I read about his life and teachings, I felt the same warmth in my chest that I'd experienced during those mysterious nighttime encounters. Could it be possible that the presence I'd been feeling, the voice that had been speaking to me in the darkness, belonged to this man from the ancient stories? The idea should have terrified me, should have sent me running back to the safety of familiar doctrines and established authorities. Instead, it filled me with a joy so intense I could barely contain it. Everything I'd been searching for, everything my heart had been crying out for in those desperate midnight questions, was right here in these stories about a man who embodied perfect love and perfect truth. This wasn't the demanding, distant deity of my childhood, requiring endless submission and perfect obedience. This was someone who had walked among broken people and offered them healing, who had looked at systems of oppression and spoken truth that set captives free, who had loved so completely that even his enemies couldn't destroy the beauty of what he offered. I read through the night, tears streaming down my face as story after story revealed a kind of divine love I'd never imagined possible. When dawn broke and I heard my family stirring in other parts of the house, I carefully hid the book and prepared to face another day of pretending nothing had changed. But everything had changed. I now had a name for the presence that had been reaching out to me, a face to attach to the voice that had been calling me home. I couldn't look away from what I'd discovered, couldn't unknown what I now knew about love without boundaries and grace without conditions. The man in the book understood my questions because he had asked them too. He understood my horror at religious hypocrisy because he had challenged it himself. He understood my hunger for authentic truth because he claimed to be truth itself, not as a concept or doctrine, but as a living reality that could be experienced directly, personally, intimately. For the first time in my life, I felt like I was encountering God as he actually was, rather than as human authorities had defined him to be. Everything I believed was cracking, but I was no longer afraid of the breaking. Something beautiful was growing in the ruins of my old certainties, something that made the loss of everything familiar seem like a small price to pay for finally finding what was real. But nothing prepared me for what happened next. When the man from the stories stepped out of the pages and into my room, when Isa himself came to finish what he had started in my heart, that first night I whispered his name into the darkness. I was reading the book again, lost in a story about him healing a blind man, when the air in my room began to shimmer and change. The familiar darkness gave way to a soft, golden light that seemed to emanate from everywhere and nowhere. And suddenly he was there, sitting on the edge of my bed, as if he had always belonged in that space. I wasn't dreaming, though the experience felt more vivid than any dream I'd ever had. This was happening in the solid, tangible world of my physical room, but the rules that governed that world seemed to have been temporarily suspended to allow for this impossible encounter. He looked exactly as I'd begun to imagine him from the stories, but also completely different. His face was kind but overwhelming, human but somehow more than human, familiar and alien at the same time. When he spoke, his voice was the same gentle whisper that had been calling to me in the darkness. But now it filled the room with warmth and presence that made my whole body tremble. "Ahmad," he said, and hearing my name in his voice made me fall to my knees beside the bed, overwhelmed by a mixture of fear and recognition and desperate longing. "I know," he continued, and somehow those two words contained everything I'd been struggling with for months. He knew about my questions and my doubts and my horror at the cruelty I'd witnessed. He knew about my loneliness and my confusion and my desperate hunger for truth. He knew about the risks I was taking by reading forbidden books and entertaining dangerous thoughts. He knew, and instead of condemning me for my wandering heart, he had come to meet me in my searching, to reveal himself to the broken places that traditional religion had never been able to reach. "You've been looking for me," he said, and it wasn't a question but a statement of fact that resonated in my bones with the truth of recognition. I had been looking for him, though I hadn't known his name or face until recently. Every time I'd felt sick at the gap between religious words and religious actions, I'd been looking for him. Every time I'd wondered if there was a God who actually cared about suffering instead of just demanding submission. I'd been looking for him. Every time I'd questioned whether love could exist without conditions and control, I'd been looking for him. He reached out and touched my forehead, the same gesture from my first encounter with that mysterious presence. But this time, I could see his hand, could feel the warmth of his skin against mine. The touch sent waves of peace through my entire body, calming fears I didn't even know I was carrying, healing wounds I'd been too proud to acknowledge. "You don't have to choose between love and truth," he said, his voice gentle but absolutely certain. "I am both." In that moment, everything I'd been wrestling with for months suddenly made perfect sense. The reason traditional religious answers had felt hollow was because they were incomplete, shadows of truth rather than truth itself. The reason I'd been so disturbed by the gap between religious claims and religious practice was because my heart had been calibrated to recognize authentic love. And what I'd been seeing wasn't it. The reason I'd felt so alone in my questioning was because I'd been seeking something most people had settled for substitutes of, something that required courage and honesty and willingness to lose everything false in order to find what was real. He stayed with me for what felt like hours, though time seemed to behave differently in his presence. We didn't talk about theology or doctrine or religious obligations. Instead, he listened as I poured out everything I'd been carrying, all the pain and confusion and desperate questions that had been eating me alive. He didn't offer explanations or justifications for the suffering I'd witnessed. Instead, he wept with me over it, sharing my grief at the way his love had been twisted into systems of control and his truth had been used to justify cruelty. When he finally began to fade, becoming translucent like morning mist, he left me with words that would echo in my heart for the rest of my life. "Follow me, not them. Trust love, not fear. Seek truth, not safety." The golden light gradually dimmed until my room returned to normal darkness, but I was forever changed. The presence I'd been sensing for weeks had revealed himself fully. And now I knew beyond any doubt who had been calling my name in the darkness, who had been preparing my heart for this moment of complete transformation. I spent the rest of the night sitting in stunned silence, trying to process what had happened, but knowing that understanding would come slowly, over time. What I knew immediately was that everything had changed. I couldn't go back to pretending that the system I'd grown up in was adequate when I'd experienced perfect love firsthand. I couldn't continue performing religious obligations that felt empty when I'd encountered the living reality those obligations were supposed to point toward. I couldn't keep living a lie when truth himself had looked me in the eyes and called me by name. The next 3 days passed in a haze of barely controlled emotion as I tried to figure out what to do with this life-altering encounter. Every conversation with my family felt like speaking a foreign language. Every familiar routine seemed like elaborate theater. I was still physically present in their world, but spiritually I had crossed into territory they wouldn't understand, couldn't follow me into without experiencing their own fundamental transformation. The isolation was complete, but strangely peaceful, because I was no longer alone. Even when I couldn't see him or hear his voice, I could feel his presence like a steady flame in my chest, warming me from the inside out. My father noticed my distraction and attributed it to spiritual growth, praising me for what he interpreted as deeper devotion to traditional practices. The irony was almost unbearable. I was further from their version of faith than I'd ever been, but closer to actual divine relationship than I'd ever imagined possible. When he suggested I begin preparing for a formal role in mosque leadership, I nearly laughed at the absurdity of it. How could I teach others to find God through systems I now knew were obstacles to real encounter? How could I represent traditions that had become cages when I just experienced the freedom of unlimited love? But I also understood that I couldn't simply announce what had happened without destroying my family and putting myself in genuine danger. The men who controlled our religious community had proven their willingness to disappear, people who became inconvenient. And my story would definitely qualify as inconvenient. Young men weren't supposed to have direct encounters with the divine that bypassed religious authority. Claims of personal revelation were treated as either mental illness or heretical rebellion, both of which carried severe consequences in our tightly controlled environment. So, I began to plan my departure carefully, quietly. I couldn't stay and live a lie, but I also couldn't leave. In a way that would bring persecution on my family or put them in an impossible position with their community, I started withdrawing gradually, spending more time away from home, becoming less available for family obligations. When asked, I explained that I was going through a period of intense spiritual seeking and needed solitude for prayer and reflection. This was actually true, though not in the way they understood it. During my solitary hours, I returned again and again to the small book that had opened this entire journey for me. Now that I'd met Isa face to face, the stories took on new dimensions of meaning. I could see his personality in the words attributed to him, could recognize the same infinite gentleness and fierce love for truth that I'd experienced in my room that transformative night. Reading about his conflicts with religious authorities of his own time, I understood that what I was experiencing was part of a pattern as old as organized religion itself. The tension between institutional control and authentic spiritual encounter. He had walked this path before me, had faced the choice between safety within established systems and the dangerous freedom of following divine love wherever it led. He had chosen truth over security, love over law, authentic relationship over religious performance, and he had paid for that choice with his life, though the book made it clear that even death couldn't contain the reality of who he was or stop the spread of the love he embodied. If I followed him, I would be walking a path that had always required everything from those brave enough to take it. The certainty grew stronger each day that I couldn't delay much longer. Every morning I spent pretending to be someone I was no longer felt like a betrayal of the gift I'd been given. Every evening prayer I participated in while hiding the transformation happening inside me felt like lying to the very presence that had revealed himself so completely. I was being called to a different kind of faith, one that required honesty instead of compliance, courage instead of comfort, love instead of fear. My mother sensed the change first, asking gentle questions about my health and happiness that I deflected with vague reassurances. My sisters assumed I was preparing for marriage and began offering advice about choosing a suitable wife, completely unaware that I was actually preparing to leave everything familiar behind in pursuit of a love that couldn't be contained within. Their understanding of proper relationships. My father continued to speak about my bright future in religious leadership, never suspecting that his son was about to walk away from everything that future represented. The breaking point came on a Friday evening when my father asked me to assist with evening prayers at the mosque. Standing beside him as he led the congregation through familiar verses, I felt the full weight of the hypocrisy I was being asked to participate in. These same men who spoke so beautifully about divine mercy were the ones who had arranged for Layla's disappearance. These voices that proclaimed God's justice were the ones that had laughed about breaking a young woman's spirit for the crime of being victimized. I couldn't do it anymore. I couldn't stand there and pretend to worship alongside people who used faith as a weapon against the vulnerable. When the prayers ended, I remained kneeling on the floor long after everyone else had stood and begun their conversations. My father eventually came over to check on me, placing his hand on my shoulder with genuine concern. "What's wrong, my son?" he asked, and the kindness in his voice almost broke my resolve. He loved me within the limits of his understanding, just as I had loved him within the limits of mine. But those limits had been shattered by an encounter with unlimited love, and I could no longer pretend they were adequate. "I need to leave," I said quietly, the words falling from my lips before I'd consciously decided to speak them. "I can't stay here anymore." The confusion and hurt that crossed his face was exactly what I'd been dreading, but it was also inevitable. There was no way to explain my decision that wouldn't sound like rejection of everything he'd given me, everything he'd hoped for me, everything he'd built his own life around. In his world, leaving meant failure, meant weakness, meant turning away from truth toward deception. But in my world, staying would have meant all of those things. I had been given a glimpse of reality too beautiful and too true to abandon for the sake of others' comfort. I had been called by name and invited into a relationship that made every substitute pale by comparison. I had been loved without conditions and accepted without reservations by someone who saw every hidden part of my heart and found it worthy of infinite grace. How could I trade that for the safety of living within walls that now felt like a prison? The conversation that followed was the most painful of my life. My father alternated between anger and pleading, between threats and promises, between accusations and expressions of deep love. My mother was called, then my sisters, then my uncle and other respected members of our community. Everyone tried to talk sense into me, to understand what had gone wrong, to fix whatever was broken that was making me throw away such a promising future. None of them could hear what I was really saying because the language I now spoke was foreign to their experience. I tried to explain without revealing too much, speaking about feeling called to a different path, about needing to find truth for myself rather than accepting what others had defined for me. I emphasized my love for them and my gratitude for everything they'd given me, trying to help them understand that my leaving wasn't rejection of them personally, but response to something larger than family loyalty or community expectations. But in a culture where individual spiritual seeking was seen as dangerous pride, where questioning established interpretations was viewed as the first step toward apostasy, my words only confirmed their worst fears about what was happening to me. The interventions continued for days. Religious authorities were consulted, prayers were offered for my wayward soul, promises were made about opportunities that would be waiting if I would just come to my senses and return to the proper path. Throughout it all, I felt the steady presence of the one who had called me, warming my heart and giving me strength to resist the enormous pressure to surrender my newfound freedom for the sake of others' peace of mind. It would have been so much easier to give in, to pretend the encounter had never happened, to settle back into the comfortable numbness of religious performance. But every time I considered surrendering, I would remember his face, the way he had looked at me with such complete understanding and acceptance. I would remember his voice speaking my name with a love I'd never experienced before. I would remember the peace that had flooded through me when he touched my forehead, the certainty that had filled me when he promised I would never be alone again. Those memories were more real than the pressure surrounding me, more true than the arguments being used to convince me I was making a terrible mistake. Finally, I understood that no amount of explanation would make this transition gentle or easy. The gap between where I was and where my family stood was too wide to bridge with words. They were looking at my decision through the lens of everything they'd been taught to fear about spiritual rebellion, while I was looking at it through the lens of everything I'd experienced about spiritual freedom. We were seeing the same action from completely different perspectives, and neither of us could fully understand the other's viewpoint without having walked in each other's shoes. So I made my choice with as much love and as much regret as I'd ever felt about anything in my life. I packed a small bag with essentials, left letters for each family member trying to explain my gratitude and my hope that someday they might understand, and walked out of the house where I'd spent my entire life. The night air was cool against my skin, and every step away from everything familiar felt both like loss and like liberation. I was walking into uncertainty, but I was walking toward truth. I was leaving behind security, but I was moving toward authentic relationship with the one who had called my name in the darkness. As I reached the edge of our neighborhood and looked back at the lights of home, I felt Isa's presence surrounding me like an invisible embrace. "I will never leave you," his voice whispered in my heart, and I knew that whatever lay ahead, I would not be facing it alone. The man who had loved me enough to reveal himself fully was walking this path with me, would continue walking it with me no matter where it led. That knowledge gave me courage to keep moving forward, even as everything behind me called out for me to return to safety, to familiarity, to the life I'd been expected to live. I found myself at the crest of a hill overlooking our city as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Below me spread the lights of thousands of homes, each one representing a life like the one I was leaving behind, filled with routines and expectations and comfortable certainties I no longer shared. But above me stretched the infinite mystery of a universe where divine love could break through any boundary, where truth could find anyone brave enough to seek it, where grace could transform even the most broken heart into something beautiful. The words came without conscious thought, rising from a place deeper than fear or doubt or human reasoning. "Isa," I whispered into the cool night air. "I believe." The name felt like coming home, like speaking my native language for the first time, like finally admitting what had been true in my heart since the moment he first spoke to me in the darkness of my room. I believed in his love that had no conditions. I believed in his truth that set captives free. I believed in his grace that could heal any wound and forgive any failure. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of jasmine and the promise of rain, and I felt his smile like sunlight breaking through clouds. This was only the beginning of the journey he was calling me to, only the first step on a path that would require everything I had to give and offer everything I'd been searching for in return. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring or how I would survive in a world where my faith made me a stranger to everyone I'd ever known. But I knew who was walking with me, and that was enough. For the first time in my life, I was completely free, and I had never been less alone.